Thank you for having me. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Ross. It's really a great pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Ross Sawyers, and to speak tonight. Ross and I will tell basically anyone who will listen a story that makes us both sound very, very old. We first met 27 years ago in 1999, which I realize is before many of you were born. So I was studying painting at the Kansas City Art Institute, and Ross was studying photography and new media there. And because the school was really tiny with about 400 students total, everyone knew everyone, and we all looked at the work everyone was making in their studios. So at that time, Ross was building little miniature houses with little figurines and I think even little furniture, and making these weird little worlds that he would only photograph. He would only see it through the lens of his camera. And I then had very little interest in photography. Sorry to all you photo people. But the pictures really stuck in my brain. So about 10 years later, he was walking in the doors to this building one day as I was leaving because I was already working here at the museum. And we realized that we were going to soon become professional colleagues as well. So over the years, our friendship has grown, and it's been really magical when we get to collaborate. We've taught a class here at Columbia together. And recently, we worked on this exhibition that I think he's going to tell you about in a minute, called The Future Still Isn't What It Used to Be, which is on view at the Riverside Art Center. So I hope you all can visit this exhibition if you're interested in his work. It's great because I curated it, of course. So it's, I think, a really great show, but also it's a great way to experience many of his works over the decades in kind of a sampling of sorts. So you can see a lot of his practice over the last 20 years in this one sort of small exhibition. And while we planned that exhibition, he told me many times that he really despises language around his artwork. He hates artist statements. He hates wall text and labels that tell you what the art is about and what you should think about it, which really aggravated me as a curator because this is how I earn my living, is making that content. So we had a healthy amount of debate about whether or not there should be any language around the exhibition that we worked on together. And eventually I won, and he acquiesced and let me write a little statement. So tonight you get to have the rare experience of hearing Ross put language to his artwork, and I'm really excited for you all to experience that. So with that, I'll give him a little bit of an introduction formally. Ross has exhibited nationally and internationally at venues including the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, the Henry Art Museum in Seattle, and the Tacoma Art Museum in Washington. His work is included in numerous collections, including the Museum of Contemporary Photography next door, the Hallmark Photography Collection at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, and the Henry Art Gallery. He earned his BFA in Photography and New Media at the Kansas City Art Institute and his MFA in Interdisciplinary Visual Art at the University of Washington. He is an associate professor and former chair of the former photography department at Columbia College Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Ross.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. In a former job, I used to introduce a lot of people speaking from this stage. So it's very strange to be introduced to speak on this stage. So I'm honored to be here. So thank you for having me. So before I really get into things, as Heather and Kristen both mentioned, the talk for this the title for this talk and for the exhibition that I have up right now is "The Future Still Isn't What It Used to Be," and that title exists because the last exhibition I had was titled "The Future Isn't What It Used to Be," and not much has gotten better since then. So that's why the future still isn't what it used to be. So I'm gonna actually go back further in my practice than I think I would have had I not worked on this exhibition with Kristen. And so this is one of the walls in the exhibition, and this wall in and of itself is about 20 years between the first photograph and the last photograph. And it really got me thinking, and as soon as I looked at it, I was reminded of a quote from my favorite book, which is called Station 11. Do you like that book too? It's amazing, right? Everybody should read it. And there's no spoilers here, but at one point, one of the characters says about his brother the following: Frank, standing on a stool in his wondrously functional pre-Libya legs, the bullet that would sever his spinal cord still 25 years away, but already approaching. Now, it's a little depressing, but that's what ran through my mind when I saw these 4 photographs spanning 20 years. When I made that red photograph, the housing market hadn't collapsed yet. Trump was just a guy who had a TV show. We hadn't dealt with a pandemic. So kind of looking backwards and like thinking about myself making this kind of art before those kind of those bullets were on their way towards us, but unbeknownst to us at the time. So yeah, so like I said, I'm going to start earlier than I might have otherwise. This is a photograph from 2005, so 21 years ago. And I made this photograph in Seattle. Kristen mentioned that at one point I made little sort of dollhouse sized constructions with toys and lots of other things happening. And when I got to Seattle, I didn't want to do that anymore, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So, I did what artists usually do. I just looked around, right? I used my world and kind of figured out what it was that I wanted to talk about. And at that moment in time, the thing that was really shocking to me was the density of Seattle. So I moved to Seattle from Kansas City. Kansas City is not a small city, but it's a Midwestern city. So there's lots and lots of land all around that the city can grow into. Seattle is a peninsula, so there's really nowhere for it to grow. And at this time in the early 2000s, Amazon is growing leaps and bounds. Microsoft is growing leaps and bounds. It's a real tech hub. So one of the things that I kept noticing was how the city was changing over weeks. It seemed like 1 week I would go to the bus stop and there'd be 2 or 3 single family homes on a lot. And it felt like the next week I'd go to that same bus stop and there was a high rise on it with, 50 condo units or whatever. And so I really started to think about how that kind of crunch, I tried to figure out how I would visualize that, right? How do you visualize density? So I started, and I should have led with this. Every photograph that I will show you tonight is a construction that I build and light in my studio. So I started building my spaces in ways that exaggerated that density, that overcrowding, and thinking about spaces that built around instead of next to, things of that nature. And it was, really helped me understand how my work comes to be, which at this point was a process of really critically looking at my surroundings, to the point that I would go to, model home openings and new condo buildings opening just to kind of see what was going on. One of my favorite moments from that experience of going to these things was I was going through this, open house on a weekend of this brand new housing development. And I'm, we're inside, we're kind of getting a tour from the realtor, and the realtor's like, okay, let's go outside. And so we go outside and the houses are so close that the roofs are almost touching. And this little boy looks up at his dad and says, "Are we outside yet?" Which I loved because we were outside. And then at that same thing, if you bought one of the units, you got a choice between a fence in your backyard or a refrigerator. Couldn't have both, but you could have one of them, which I really liked. So kind of realizing how important it was to me to watch and look at what was happening around me, it was really important. And I started doing that more and more. And I never took a camera with me. I'm not that kind of photographer. I have a lot of respect for those kinds of photographers. But when I'm out in the world, I'm looking for inspiration for then what I might do in my studio. So much like a canary in the coal mine, 2007-ish, that all of that construction started coming to a halt. It really started to quickly stop. And there was this ordinance in Seattle at the time that a multi-unit development could not be completed until 75% of the units were sold. So as a precursor to the housing market collapsing, all of these large high-rises, the construction just stopped on them because they couldn't sell them all and they couldn't get to that 75% threshold. So they sat empty and unfinished. And one of the things that I found to be this plastic material was everywhere. All of these buildings were wrapped in plastic, like presents, and I described it as breathing, because as the weather would change, the plastic would either expand or contract. And so I got really fascinated by this material that referenced this incomplete, this unfinished nature of things. And also it did something that was really great, in that one of the things that I struggled with was how to make the sky look like the sky. But then when you put a piece of plastic in between your camera and the blue paper, it just looks like a sky. It's kind of amazing. So I got really into the plastic. And again, sort of thinking about what it meant and what it stood for. Very close friend of mine referred to this billowing plastic as placental once. And so then we used that joke, and she was going to become the preeminent collector of placental art, and I was going to become the preeminent maker of placental art. Neither of those things happened. But this particular photograph started something that carries through today. I don't, if any of my students are in here, they've heard me say this. I don't enjoy photographing people. It's why I have a studio in a basement. I can go and sit by myself and make pictures. So I never wanted to photograph people. I never wanted to add people to these spaces, but I did want to start implying that people exist in time and space around these environments. And so what happened with this photograph is I made this room, and then there was something, I don't even remember what, just some piece of wood or material or foam core or something sitting on the floor. And then I decided to add the window on the left. So as I was cutting that window, all the sawdust came out, and where the object was sitting is clean. And so when I picked up that object, I was about to sweep all that sawdust out of it. And then I realized that's what I was trying to do. Like this, action right here is the implication of people. And so that became really exciting to me. These pieces are not a diptych, but they are the same model. So if you look through the door on the right, you're now looking into this room, and vice versa. Are you asking a question, Biddy?
Yeah. So were they installations or these books?
No, these are photographs. So yes, good question. There's one exception to this at the end, but I make these things to photograph them, to show you the photographs. These are not documentation photographs of sculpture or installation. And one of the reasons, well, there's lots of reasons for that, but one of the things I love about photography is that the camera is a transformative tool. We're conditioned to think about photography as truth-telling, as when you point the camera at something and you make the picture, it documents that moment in time and space. I love photography because the camera changes everything. Photographs are not true. They don't tell us anything objective at all. So for me, the camera functions in this way to transform these spaces into what I want you looking at. So I started thinking more and more about how I can start to even more directly imply presence of people. So I just literally started drawing on them, which is, it's a hard word for me to use. So I thought for a long time that I was a really bad drawer. And what I realized is that I'm not good at rendering, right? I can't draw anything to look like the thing that I'm drawing, but that's not drawing. At least for me, it's not. And I started thinking about things much more in terms of mark making. So like this simple square rectangle, I'm thinking about the marks that it makes. And then if you can see the sort of faded marks that have been erased, thinking about layers and time and all of that stuff. So this practice of adding to these spaces after I had completed building them became something that I was really interested in. So right around this time, that first bullet I was talking about hits, right? So we're heading into 2008. I'm a photographer that's looking at a lot of housing and dwellings, and all of the sudden, the housing market explodes. I mean, literally, like the whole country is thrown into a recession. Some would call it a depression. People are getting kicked out of their homes left and right. And at this time, I moved from Seattle to Southern California, Riverside to be exact, which is part of a community called Moreno Valley, which is Riverside and a couple other little communities. And it just so happened that that area, Moreno Valley, was one of the hardest hit areas in the country for foreclosures. There were entire developments that were empty to the point that wildlife started moving back in. And this fascinated me. So I wanted to see these houses. I wanted to see what was inside of them. I wanted to see how that transition from home to empty structure. So I figured out, I have a good friend who's a realtor. And so I called him and I was like, how can I get in these houses? This is a secret. Don't tell anybody. But he was like, here's the insider's trick. You know, the lock boxes that hang on the doors of houses that are for sale? The code for that is almost always the address of the house. So don't tell anybody. So I was able to all of a sudden I had access to all of these houses. I won't even say 9 out of 10, 99 out of 100 houses I could get into. So I just sort of, and again, I'm not taking my camera with me at all. I'm sort of looking at these spaces from the point of view of an anthropologist. And one of the things that I found immediately was the damage that had been done to these structures. Now, the damage was done for a number of different reasons. I distilled it down to 2 primary reasons. So the first reason was economic, right? There were a lot of houses where the people had gone through and pulled all the copper pipes out of the walls, all the copper wiring, so then they could sell those materials. And then the second was anger and just a giant fuck you to whoever took this house from me. So there was a lot of very deliberate, angry destruction happening, like pouring bags of concrete down the toilet, you know, ripping up all of the tile and making sure every single tile is broken, graffiti, everything. And, you know, it was really hard at times to be going through these places and to be empathizing with these people who had literally been kicked out of. Some of them came home to find their belongings in their front yard with the house locked up by the sheriff. So for me, what I started thinking about is how do I talk about these things, or how do I represent these things in my photographs without, I guess, with still having some grace and care for the people that I was thinking about and that were actually dealing with this. So, you know, when I was making these photographs, I tried to put myself in the space of, you know, of a person, you know, sort of a person in these houses, you know, in a world where humans didn't exist anymore, and trying to think about how I would want to see them, or what kinds of marks that I would want to add to them. And again, this is, to me, I always use this one. I should have said this earlier. This line, that's a drawn line to me. I just drew that line with a hammer instead of a pencil. You know, same with this one. There is a drawn line, but then this is also drawing to me, this gesture of making these lines, making these marks, you know, circles, like these 2 circles compared to this opening, compared to the opening behind it, just really thinking not just about the spaces themselves, but the kind of interventions and interactions I wanted to have with them. This is an example of drawing with a saw. Yeah. So this was a really kind of exciting and freeing moment in my work, because I was figuring out how to incorporate the things like drawing and sculpture and humans and history and all of this stuff into the photographs that I had been trying to figure out for quite a while. This investigation led me to go a little bit further, and something weird that kind of happened that was a catalyst for these next few photographs was I was watching Mad Men. I don't know how many of you watch that show. It's a good show. There's one particular episode where the protagonist, it's a flashback to when he was a child. And he flashes back to when he was a child during the Depression. And so he's on his farm with his family as a child, and a hobo, a migrant worker, comes through looking for work or looking for money. And at the end of the episode, he teaches Don these symbols that hobos would leave for each other to either warn each other or tell each other that this is here, you know, this is a good place to get food or whatever. And that symbol language became an obsession of mine for a number of years. I'm not sure that it's entirely over, but I was fascinated by this privileged information, right? These symbols that you had to know what they meant, otherwise you had no access to them. And then the more I dug into that, the more I learned about this. And there's a lot of debate as to whether or not this language ever actually functioned the way that people say that it functions now. Like there's equally as much evidence that this is all mythology and this was, quote unquote, invented years after the sort of the heyday of the hobos moving across the country. And if it is made up, if it's not real, I love it even more. So I really gravitated towards these symbols that, that when you see them, they must mean something, but you don't know what they mean. So that led me to think a little bit about that time period, in the early 20th century when we had, a lot of migrant workers, particularly following the railroads. That's where hobos that's where they started, was following the railroads west. And one of the things that I learned through all of that is that when they would gather, they would call their encampments jungles. And that was I really liked that. But then I also learned at this time there was a huge migration happening in Europe, and there was a huge migrant camp in France that everyone referred to as the jungle. So it was really interesting to me to see that word sort of recontextualized and move forward 100 years. And so for the first time, I started making structures that you couldn't see inside of them. And not only could you not see inside of them, there's no way into them. So I had spent so much time making spaces that invited you in, but didn't really have anywhere for you to go once you got inside, that I decided to spend some time making spaces that implied that they're spaces, but also gave you no access to them whatsoever. But also still trying to incorporate drawing, mark making, the perception of people, evidence that someone may have been there at some point in time. And that was a pretty short-lived little exercise. It was really important. But this is the last photograph I made in that sort of chapter. And anytime I'm talking to a group that includes a lot of students, I tell what I'm about to say, because I think it's important for everyone to hear. I made this photograph, not because of this photograph, but for the first time in my artistic life, I was like, I don't know what the hell comes next. Like, I was at a loss. Like, I had hit a wall. I'd been making art in this certain vein for 10 years and it all went great. And then all of a sudden, I didn't have any more ideas and I didn't know what to do about that. So it lasted about a year. There was about a year where I didn't make any art. Got really depressed. It was not a great situation. And so one day I was like, all right, this is ridiculous. Like, I'm either going to do this or I'm not. So it's like, if I can't enliven my practice, I will move on to something else. So I set this exercise for myself where I came up with this very simple, I had a pad of paper, thick drawing paper, that if I folded it just right, I would get a room this size. And so I said, I'm going to make one of these rooms every day, and I'm going to do something different to it every day. I had no interest in the work being any good. That was not the goal at all. Some of them I actually could do quite like. But you'll notice the similarities. Like, nothing really changes here except for the room itself, the position of the camera, the lighting. I tried to simplify everything as much as I could so I could just get into this space where I could just make things. And I did that for a while. And like I said, the point of these was not to make an exhibition out of them, to make amazing art. The point was to try to get myself out of my funk and realizing some of the things that I might want to do in the future. So here's just a small sampling of them. I think by the time I was done, there were 75 or 80 of them. These are the ones that I liked the best. And I'm so glad that I did this. Like, I learned so much from it. And in part, I learned a lot from it because I didn't try to learn anything from it. I just made them, and I made them, and I made them, and I made lots of them. And then at a point when they reached a critical mass, I was like, okay, what is it? What did I just do here? And one of the things that I recognized was, again, the interest in drawing, the interest in space, the interest in combining the two. And what happened here that was the first time was, this is not based on any direct observation. This was just coming out of my head. And that was a real shift for me. I had to, I was like, well, am I allowed to do that? Am I allowed to just make something that I think about, not that I've seen? And so the next step was to take all of those rooms that I had made and start tearing them up and putting them back together. There aren't very many of these photographs. There's, I think, 3 of them, because I ran out of the old rooms. And at the time, if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend it. There's a documentary called Dark Days, and it's about a group of people who live in a train tunnel. There's no natural light that gets down into the train tunnel at all, and they all built these amazing little weird ramshackle structures. It's a black and white documentary. DJ Spooky DJs it, so it's amazing if you're into 90s hip hop. But anyway, I digress. So I was thinking a lot about that, so I started making these structures out of all of these drawings that I had made, and while at the same time really starting to explore my interest in cave painting, trying to understand what that is. So I read a couple of books and did some research, and of course we don't know exactly what they were thinking because we can't talk to them. But one of the things that kept coming up in my research was that a lot of people are like, these early humans, unlike us, they were at the bottom of the food chain. They weren't at the top. They were prey. Or at least some of them were prey. They were insecure in the world. They didn't have the kind of structures for safety that we have. And so there's this thought that they were doing what we do, which is trying to figure things out. And one of the ways that they were figuring it out was to bring the outside into the inside, where it was safe. One of the most mind-blowing things I learned was, in art history, we see these cave drawings as slides. So we see them as these flat two-dimensional objects. But a lot of them are drawn onto very dimensional rock formations. That's clear that the artist chose that because the shape is reminiscent of whatever they were drawing. And so this idea that these drawings were also this 3-dimensional thing was really interesting to me. And so, I started getting really into that notion of using these drawings and thinking about how we can draw to sort of make sense of things. And the pandemic hits, which at first, and we all experienced it in our own ways. I'm an artist that works in my studio. I'm an artist that doesn't love a lot of human interaction. I was like, this is going to be awesome. Like this is great. Obviously that changed very quickly, but it didn't go the way I thought it would. I think a lot of people, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I would go down to my studio and all I would think about was the pandemic raging around us. But it did give me this sort of narrative to start thinking about, which is what kind of spaces, structures, worlds would I live in a world that falls apart? Which it very much, I don't think I'm going to surprise anybody, very much felt like the world was falling apart during the early stages of the pandemic. So then I started acting like a cave painter and bringing the outside inside. Maybe whoever lives in this space can't go outside. So you draw the sun, you draw the moon phases, you draw some clouds, you use this space to provide what you can't experience. And there's this saying I've heard a lot that, a home doesn't feel like home until you start putting stuff on the walls. So then I'm thinking about these sort of ramshackle homes that I'm going to make and what would I put on these walls? And then, sort of meticulous marking of time, hash marks, really trying to imagine this world that felt very plausible, that felt just around the corner where we were all going to be responsible for ourselves. And around the same time, I read this essay by a comedian named crap, that just disappeared from my brain. His first name is John. His last name will come to me and then I'll tell you and it'll be out of context and make no sense. But John Hodgman, there it is, John Hodgman. And he wrote this essay about the popularity of the zombie apocalypse genre. Very funny essay, but he posits, and I feel like he's onto something. He's like the zombie apocalypse narrative became so popular because you get to be the hero of your own narrative, right? You get to be the sheriff in The Walking Dead that saves your family and everybody around you, or you get to sort of decide your own fate. So I started thinking about myself in terms of world building and like, what kind of world would I build and who would I build it for? I have a wife and I have a son who at that time was much smaller than he is now. So I'm thinking, all right, what am I going to do to what kind of places am I going to make to support whatever the future looks like? The future still isn't what it used to be. And so this way of working was incredibly rewarding and exciting because I wasn't trying to exaggerate something that I was seeing in the world. I was just world building and starting from, I can't get my mouse. Hold on, I'll just do it this way. So starting from this slide, all of these are the same basic model. I just kept adding to it. Whereas in previous work, I knew what I thought I knew what I wanted the thing to look like. So I built the thing, I photographed it. It looked like I wanted it to look, got rid of it, started the next thing. But this time I didn't do that. I built something, I photographed it, and I started adding to it. And then I photographed it again and again and again. I think I ended up getting about 60 photographs out of this construction. I see Julie's like, I have that piece. And this was an important moment too, because it fell apart. And I was like, all right, well, that's the end of that. And then I was like, wait a minute, why does it have to be the end of that? So then I cleaned it up and started over again with the same basic structure. And again, it was hitting everything that I wanted to be doing. I was making objects. I was photographing them the way that I wanted to be photographing. I was adding all of these marks and these different kinds of drawings. I'll go back just for a second. Like, it's hard to see. Well, it's actually not that hard to see. I think of like this wire as a drawn line sort of zigzagging across. So I was, like I said, I was just really happy with the way it was all going. And for the first time in my artistic career, I really felt like I was doing something fully of myself that was communicating the things that I wanted it to communicate. And so, what happens when, I have this really horrible drawing that I subject my students to about creative process and moving ideas from intuition to consciousness and that whole process. But then I got to a point again where I was like, all right, I've made so many photographs of this one structure. There's not really a lot left that I want to do with it. And so I didn't really know what I wanted to do next. And so instead of waiting too long like I did the last time, and getting to a point where I was depressed and didn't want to make any art, I decided to give myself homework again. I decided to create a set of parameters for myself, much like the rooms that I was going to photograph, just as sort of a palette cleanser, right? This will be fun. So I call them tables. I made 100 of these little tables, right? It's a 4-inch by 4-inch piece of wood with 4 dowels hot glued to the bottom of it. Not fine craftsmanship. And I just said, okay, I'm going to rearrange these towers as many times as I can to make photographs that I like. And I don't really, like I said, that was it. I took these tables, rearrange them, make a photograph, rearrange them, make a photograph. And I ended up getting 11 photographs of the rearranged towers that I really liked. They didn't last as long as the rooms. This was a few days instead of a few months. But it was a really great kind of palette cleanser. And so I do that a lot now. When I'm feeling a little bit stuck, I just give myself some parameters to repeat. And this actually really awesomely turned into this artist book that Skylark Editions published recently, called 11 Towers because there's 11 of them, where the book itself is a top-bound spiral, and then it sits in this book stand, so the book itself becomes a tower. And as you get bored, if you get bored with one, you've got 11 images, right? Like if you get bored with one, you just turn the page, and then you've got another one. And so again, that helped me sort of get out of my funk again. I started re-embracing the ideas of drawing that were interesting to me, focusing a little bit less on the spaces themselves, thinking about like how I can continue to build things that for me are built in the way that I would imagine building a drawing. At one point I got optimistic, which is weird for me. Sun's rising, it's a new day, maybe the future is what we want it to be, but it's not. So that was very short-lived. But it came back a little bit, and I was like, oh yeah, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. And then no, it's not going to be okay. And, and again, like using these like rudimentary drawings, to talk about, how people might interact with this place. And I was reminded of actually in this room, years ago, one of my favorite artists, John Davola, came to do a lecture in photography. And he taught, if you don't know his work, he photographs actual spaces that exist, but he does a lot of spray painting and painting back into the spaces before he photographs them. And somebody in the audience asked him about his painting skills, and he goes, I don't have to be a good painter, I'm a photographer. And I was like, shit, I don't have to be a good drawer, I'm a photographer. So it really like helped me understand that I was making these things for the photograph, which is a through line of my work for 25 years now, but I forget that sometimes. So it's good to be reminded of that. And now the sort of last, I talked faster than I thought I was going to. When I practice these things, I go way slower. So the last thing I'll show you, so as Kristen mentioned in her introduction, I have an exhibition up right now at the Riverside Art Center. It's up through March 7th. And it's been about 2 years since I scheduled the show. When I requested a show, they were like, we like it if our artists partner with a curator. And I was like, well, I know one of those. So I called my friend Kristen and I was like, you want to be the curator? And she was like, yes. I had no idea what that meant. Like, I didn't know what that meant. And then she started she rightfully was like, I need to see all of your art. And I was like, fine. So I made this shared folder with 25 years worth of art in it. And she started picking pieces out that are not any of the pieces that I would have picked out. And at first I was like, I don't want to show this one. I want to show this one. But I let the process go. I was like, nope, Kristen's curating it. She knows what she's doing. So the front room turned into this almost like mini retrospective, right? There are not a ton of photographs in the room, but there's photographs that go back 20 years and there's photographs that go back 20 days. And that was fascinating to me to kind of see that happen and to make some of those connections. But in the back room, I wanted to do something that has been, I don't know, it's something that I have been asked about constantly. Yes, there's some color. It doesn't last, don't worry. So, you made me lose my train of thought, Alice. Oh, okay, I'm back. So, for years, and Biddy also kind of did it today. Like, what are these? Are these sculptures? Are these photographs? Are you documenting something? And, my answer has always been very firm that no, I'm not documenting something. I don't show the models with the photographs because the model is not the thing I want you to see. I want to use the camera as that transformative tool that it is and it functions so well as. But I wanted to try something. I wanted to try to make some photographs and then show an object with those photographs to see what would happen. So I made this tower out of cardboard, basically. And I photographed it. And then I photographed it again. And I photographed it again. and a couple more times, which I don't have those images with me. And so I made these photographs, and there was something about this tower, this original one, that just stuck with me. So obviously I made some changes to it. So I decided I was going to rebuild it. And I was going to rebuild it not as something to be photographed, but as a sculpture. So the original one was made out of cardboard. This one's made out of plywood, and, you know, it's built well and it will survive. And I wanted to put it in the space with the photographs of, not of this, because that one doesn't exist, but an approximation of this, to see if there was a relationship that I was interested in between the objects and between the photograph and the object. So in this particular room, you can't see the other wall. There's 3 large photographs and this singular tower. And I don't know yet. It's been 3 weeks. I don't know. I really like the object and I really like the photographs, but I don't know if they go together or not. And then I asked myself the question, like, if they go together, do they have to stay together? Like, can the photographs be viewed without the object? Can the object be viewed without the photographs? I don't know. Stop asking. I don't know. So that's where I'm at. That's, you know, exploring the object photograph relationship, continuing to, you know, think about the dystopia that we live in, or at least potentially live in. And yeah, thanks for your time.